Good evening and welcome to the virtual Princeton Public Library. My name is Nora and I am a part of the program team here, and it is my pleasure to host you tonight. This program is presented with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities and is presented in partnership with Labyrinth Books. Tonight, we will hear from scholars Marilisa Jiménez García, William Gleason, and Jonathan Zimmerman as they discuss the current rise of book banning in the United States in historical and contemporary context. Following their conversation, we will reserve about 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So overall, we'll be here for about an hour, and a few housekeeping items before we begin. We do recommend, if you're using Zoom, you use the app rather than the browser, as it may be a little clearer for you. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel within the next week following the program. We have turned on live transcription, which you as a viewer can enable for yourselves to turn on or off if you would like to use that feature. And that's available in the controls at the bottom of your screen. You'll also see a Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a mobile device, it may be towards the top, where you can feel free to add questions. And again, towards the end of the program, we will get to as many of those questions as we're able to within the time. So our presenters for tonight, we'll start with Bill Gleason, who is the Hughes Rogers Professor of English and American Studies at Princeton University. A specialist in U.S. literary and cultural history, he teaches courses on children's literature, popular culture, and the environmental humanities. He is the author and/or co-editor of 5 books, including The Pocket Instructor Literature, a collection of active learning exercises for the college literature classroom. Marilisa Jiménez García is an associate professor of children's literature at Simmons University. She is the author of Side by Side, U.S. Empire, Puerto Rico, and the Roots of Youth Literature and Culture. She researches the role of youth literature in education and racial justice struggles in the U.S. and was the founding director of the Institute on Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at Lehigh University. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Refinery 21, Children's Literature, and Latino Studies. Jonathan Zimmerman is a professor of history of education and the Berkowitz Professor in Education at the University of Pennsylvania. A former Peace Corps volunteer and high school teacher, Zimmerman is the author of 9 books, including Free Speech and Why You Should Give a Damn, and The Amateur Hour, A History of College Teaching in America, as well as the recently revised 20th anniversary edition of Who's America? Culture Wars in the Public Schools. Zimmerman is also a frequent op-ed contributor to the Washington Post, the New York Review of Books, and other popular magazines and newspapers. He has appeared on The Joe Rogan Show and dozens of other podcasts, television shows, and radio spots. He previously taught for 20 years at New York University, where he received its Distinguished Teaching Award in 2008. Thank you all so much for being with us. And without any more talking from me, let me turn things over to Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you to the library and to the NEH for sponsoring this event. Just a brief word about how we'll proceed. I'm actually going to be the moderator tonight, and I'm going to moderate a guided discussion between our panelists, Marilisa and Jonathan, about the rise of book banning in the US. I thought to set the scene, I'd just offer a few statistics from the September 2022 report by PEN America that describes the state of book banning in the US. The PEN report discovered that during the 2021-2022 school year, more than 2,500 book bans were issued across 140 school districts in 32 states, affecting more than 1,600 distinct titles. 41% of those titles have LGBTQ protagonists or prominent secondary characters. Another 40% feature protagonists or prominent secondary characters of color, and 21% directly address issues of race or racism. At least 40% of the bans are also linked to either proposed or enacted legislation or to political pressure by state officials or elected lawmakers to restrict the teaching or presence of certain books or concepts, in other words, educational gag orders. And PEN has identified at least 50 groups involved in pushing for book bans across the country, operating at national, state, and local levels. So we're talking not just about bans in school districts, but potentially bans in town libraries, public libraries. All this despite the fact, the Penn report notes that Americans of all political persuasions oppose book bans. So let's kick things off with a kind of general question that'll set the stage, I think, for this conversation. Marilisa and Jonathan, why, in your view, have book bans and educational gag orders become so pronounced today? And what's at stake in these fights? Who pays the price when these bans are enacted?
So, good evening, everyone. So one thing that I think is really important for our conversation today is to remember also the context, for example, of like the summer 2020, and to kind of go back to the time when a lot of young people were in the streets demanding, racial justice, and specifically around police brutality, and specifically around the Black Lives Matter movement, what I call 2.0. So because we had the 2014, and then we had what occurred in 2020. After the summer of 2020, there was a movement on a lot of campuses and also curriculum committees, a lot of promises by school board and principal superintendents, to teach anti-racism and to commit to anti-racism, right? So we had these different kind of moments where people were making a pledge to anti-racism. After that, shortly after that, this is also during COVID. So we were all, at home, and fall 2021 is sort of like the first time we get to campuses again, and we're all in person for the most part, to a certain degree. And this is really when you start to see sort of this pushback against anti-racism, and like, what's that going to look like? Well, what is that? How does that affect our curriculum? And so I think that that's really important to think about. So also in the context of like the promises for anti-racism, and then how they've been met also with a desire to, well, wait a minute, I don't know about that. And so I see it that way in terms of the book ban. I think it's also important to remember things like the 1776 report that comes out just before Trump leaves office. He issues the 1776 report about patriotic education, for example. And if you read that report, you're really going to see a lot of what we see in a lot of these bans, and a lot of this kind of rhetoric about, it's about patriotism. It's about, making sure we don't have anti-American sentiment, that young people are not learning to, quote unquote, hate the United States, right? So there's a lot of interesting kind of pushback, I feel, in terms of the ways that we were sort of really going into a movement of racial justice in 2020. And then all of a sudden there's this rise in book bans that, in my opinion, are countering a lot of those efforts and are in conflict with many of those efforts. So even as early as a couple weeks ago, for example, Penn State canceled its plans to have a racial justice center, which it had planned to have in 2020 during a lot of those protests. So it's just interesting, sort of like commitments during a moment where it was really a heightened moment, and a lot of people kind of really thought, hey, we have to do something about racial justice, and it should be something we do for our curriculum. And then this sort of backlash. And I think that that's really been a historical thing, in our country in many ways. I'm sure we'll talk about that. But so that's something I want to make sure I say.
First of all, a huge shout out to Bill Gleason for agreeing to moderate, and also to the Princeton Public Library. My sister and her family are longtime Princetonians. My mom recently moved to Princeton, so I've become very familiar with the library, and it's an exemplary institution and a reminder of how critical libraries are to our democracy, not just in providing information, but also in bringing citizens together to discuss public issues, which is what we're doing right now. I agree with everything that we heard from Marilisa, but I'd add a couple of other elements. If you look at the measures that Bill Gleason mentioned in the state houses, about restricting dialogue around race and gender, 138 of 139 of them were sponsored by a single party, by the Republican Party. And I think that's new, and it's important to underscore how new that is. So if you look at the list of banned books, you'll see Genderqueer, you'll see Toni Morrison's Beloved, you'll see Art Spiegelman's Mouse. Here's what you probably won't see: Mark Twain's Huck Finn or Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. The reason is most schools don't teach them anymore, at least not part of the official curriculum. And the reason for that is not because Republicans objected to them, it's because people on the left did. Now, I'm going to be really clear, I'm not equating these in any way because, of course, the recent Republican campaign has the teeth of law, all right, and is much more widespread. But I do think it's important to point out that everyone has engaged in a different form of censorship and book banning. It's taken different forms, it's had different power and different kinds of volume, but the argument is always the same. The argument is this is too dangerous and scary, and post-1950, this is going to injure the psyches of our kids. They can't handle this. It's going to harm them. It's going to hurt them. And this was the argument for getting rid of Huck Finn. And it's the argument that you see in almost all the GOP language about these other books. And there are many ironies in this, but for me, my favorite one is this is the same party, the Republican Party, that's complained about cancel culture over and over again, or about snowflakes. But if you look at the language that they use in these bans, it's redolent with that same language, with the language again of psychological harm and damage, all the danger that our young people will incur to their minds if they're exposed to this. The other thing I'd say that's different about the current campaign led by the Republicans is the near absence of religious rhetoric within it. Now, let me be clear. I have no doubt that some of this activity, especially around sex and sexuality, has religious motivations. But if you look, for example, at the Don't Say Gay law in Florida, you don't see any mention of God or religion. And in most of the other kinds of bills and movements, you don't see that either. And I think that's interesting and quite new, because if you look at other conservative censorship movements across time, going back to the movement against evolution in the 1920s, they were explicitly invoking religion. And that is not happening now. I think there are many reasons for that, but I think the biggest one is that the country has become much less religious. I think this is a change that we're so close to we can't quite appreciate yet. But by some measures, religious weekly attendance and religious affiliation have gone down 20% in 20 years. The other thing that happened over the past 2-3 decades, I think is important to this discussion, is the most devout believers, the most devout Christian believers, many of them exempted themselves from the public schools, either by patronizing Christian academies or by homeschooling. And so I think that accounts for the near absence of religious rhetoric in this whole discussion, which I do think historically is quite new.
Thank you both. Jonathan, if I could just follow up briefly, your outline of the 2 columns of books, some of the books that have been commonly banned in the recent bans, Genderqueer, Beloved, Mouse, for example, each for different reasons. And then the other list, Huck Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird, books that have been objected to on the left for, you described it as being, both columns framed as too dangerous for the psyche.
Harmful.
Or harmful. There's a difference in those objections to the location of the imagined harm, right? So in the case of Huck Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird, part of the objection is that those books may not, the students represented by the racial categories objectified in those books. And let's assume for the moment that each of those authors may be trying to address precisely the racism that exists in those societies, but in a way that students who are implicated in those racial categories might feel harm. And the books on the other side, the harm appears to be potentially to students who aren't implicated in those groups. Is that distinction fair, and does that make a difference at all?
I think it does. And again, I think all these things are worthy of discussion, but I would say that there's something else we're missing here that these all have in common, which is a lack of faith in our teachers and in our librarians. So I take Bill's point seriously, right? In the wrong hands, Huck Finn can be extremely distressing, right? Because it uses the N-word over 200 times. And, it's about, among other things, slavery, the worst blot on our history. And on, obviously the central event that we're all still trying to make sense of and deal with. So in the hands of an inarticulate or insensitive teacher, there's going to be trouble. But see, that's the other thing about censors. they don't trust the teacher ever, ever. And today, the people in Florida who are behind the Don't Say Gay law, they don't trust the teacher to deal with issues of sexuality in a competent or sensitive way in exactly the same way as people that want to get rid of Huck Finn don't trust the teachers to deal with race in a complex or sensitive way.
Jump right in.
Yeah, no, I would say I agree to a certain extent also, but I do think it's important to think about, in terms of I think what you were drawing attention to as well, Bill, is like the population of students, right? And like who's sort of like the implied reader and the implied audience and who's going to be heard in sort of the process. And I do think also with the column of books and with the bands, I do think we have, and even when I hear about like queer authors and then BIPOC authors, I think it's also really important to understand that those two categories also go together. So if we really look at BIPOC queer authors, how often they show up in these lists even more so, right? But I think even with the teacher issue, even thinking about like teachers of color and how much more vulnerable they are in terms of the space that they inhabit in their universities or in the schools. I was thinking also of like the Teach Truth campaign, the hashtag Teach Truth campaign, where some people were actually being targeted for like writing their names down to pledge to teach the truth. So the ways that some of these organizations have also gone after educators specifically, and I know even some of like the CRT websites that have shown up and like are targeting professors or targeting teachers who are, or schools that are saying that they're going to start teaching along the side. So I think there's a way that this has been weaponized also, and it's specifically along racial lines. And I do think that in certain cases, the academic freedom or the intellectual freedom doesn't necessarily always fall, to, in the same way for certain people and certain bodies in those spaces. So, I think we need to be careful about not universalizing, the things like harm and also, right, just making sure we say that too.
Look, I couldn't agree more, but for the last 10 or 15 years, I've been warning my fellow Democrats that the language of psychology will, to borrow the language we just heard, be weaponized by somebody else. So if you keep talking about triggers and microaggressions and all the harm that these different slurs and words are exacting on the population, eventually somebody else is going to pick up on that, right? And I hate to say it, but I think that's what's come to pass. I think a language that was in many ways pioneered and devised by the left, in good faith and with good reason, right, to try to protect especially vulnerable minority populations from this thing called damage, I think has been picked up by the other team. And again, I'm not equating these two movements because, again, they have different origins and they have different degrees of power. But I still don't understand how, if you were as outraged by me by the banning of Beloved in Loudoun County, you could be okay with getting rid of Huck Finn. I just don't get it. Like, how do you protect Beloved and purge Huck Finn? I mean, maybe you can, but I'm all ears. Yeah.
Jonathan, you mentioned that 138 of the 139 bands were sponsored by one party, and you offered that as something that's changed. So I wonder if I could ask both of you, because I know in your work you've both written about the deep histories of involvement with curriculum, either with book banning specifically or in simply who gets to read what, who gets to publish what. And I just wonder if you could, for our listeners, say a bit more about the past history and how today is different or what strains it's drawing on. I mean, you've both outlined some of these, but what's really unique about what's happening today in relation to the kinds of histories that you've both studied?
Okay, so I mean, I think I can, and to sort of go back to even movements like have we ever really desegregated curriculum, for example, in the United States, right? So ways that in many ways, especially student movements and parents and families of communities of color have been asking for curriculum to represent their young people, and we're really looking at a case today, especially, which I think is really different in terms of a majority minority school population, right? Whereas I think if we're thinking about the 50s and the 60s and people thinking about like, well, minority, right? But I mean, are we really a minority right now? Like some of these words are also kind of like, we're coming up with terms like majority, minority, right? In our schools, yet we still have a mostly white curriculum. We still have, and I think that's also why people are looking at certain books that, foster also certain kinds of narratives. For example, in the liberal sort of side of like, how can we teach books that are also where, like, who's the protagonist, who's seen as a villain, who is actually, an author of their own story, right? Like stories that are written by communities of color, as opposed to, a white author who's sort of imagining a romantic past about a particular moment. So I think those are also the conversations a lot of young people do want to have. And I think it's a balance of all of these things. But I think for me, I'm always going to root it in like ethnic studies struggle and like the Chicano movement, the Puerto Rican studies movement, the movement for Black studies, and really wanting to have spaces that are dedicated and that also center the knowledges of those communities so that they're not just characters in a book, but that their frameworks and their epistemologies are respected as knowledge producers, right? So I think for me, it's coming together for all of those things and trying to find a place where it's okay to be seen as an expert in your own story to a certain extent, right? So I think for me, I always want to remind people of like how long people have been waiting just to have like a Black studies curriculum. For example, in New York City, they just approved one recently for elementary. But how many of our states even have those kinds of, curriculum at all? So, there's some things that are taking forever, literally, and it's going to be 2023, and our school population looks the way that it does. And it's going to get increasingly more and more Black and brown kids.
So I agree with all that. I guess I'd just add a couple of things. As distasteful as I find these GOP-led campaigns, and again, let's be clear, that's who they're led by. I think they're right about one thing. They're right that some of the new proposed curricula represent fundamental challenges to the way Americans have traditionally learned about their past. So think about someone like the 1619 Project. Just look at the title, right? I mean, it roots our history in slavery and in Native American removal and genocide, not in liberty. And that is a challenge. I happen to think it's a good challenge. And a useful one, an extremely teachable moment. But I don't think it's useful to deny that it represents a challenge, to the way many, probably most Americans have learned about their past. So I do think that's new. The other thing that I think is new, and just to show my own colors as a liberal Democrat, disappointing to me, is that I think we're at a moment where the right has seized this idea of parent power. But if you look backwards in time and you look at how the curriculum was changed, often it was changed by people on the left and by racial minorities. So let's talk, for example, about the history of slavery and how it's been taught in the United States. I was born in 1961. And if you look at textbooks from when I was a young child, they describe slavery as a mostly beneficent institution devised by altruistic white people to civilize savage Africans. Now, they don't describe slavery like that anymore. Why not? The reason is that African Americans especially organized parent groups that put pressure on school boards and publishers. The NAACP had a textbook committee. The Urban League had a textbook committee. And they mobilized politically to fight those erroneous and racist interpretations. So look, there are a lot of reasons that Glenn Youngkin is the governor of Virginia. But I would argue the biggest reason is that Terry McAuliffe said that parents should just butt out of these issues. I think that was an unforced error, and I think it was a fatal one. I think he was wrong about that. I think he was wrong historically, and I think he was wrong politically. The answer is not to tell people to butt out, it's to tell more people to butt in. So if you don't like Moms for Liberty, form Moms for Freedom. Don't say, oh, shut up, stupid people. You have no business here, because that's ahistorical. Obviously, citizens have had a hugely salutary effect at different times on the curriculum. Also, I'd argue a negative one. But it just doesn't jive with the way Americans see school politics. Voters see themselves as very close to the schools. Our schools are locally run. And so voters and citizens feel, and I think appropriately, that they do and should have a hand in forging school policy. And so if you don't like what certain people are doing to try to influence the curriculum, don't tell them to butt out, butt in.
Yeah, I was going to say it's really a challenge to do that though, right? I mean, I think if we're trying to get people to come together to sort of have these conversations, and I think more often than not, you're not going to have that sort of, people kind of coming together to have the conversation. But I agree that, a lot of parents and families and, students as well. And I think some of the things that we might be seeing also, like in the York district, for example, where you see the students were the ones that really were the one that kind of brought it together, and the teachers as well. So we have these like really amazing examples of that happening. But more often than not, I think what ends up happening is that fear sort of is what's produced, and people start kind of running off of that. And it does turn into a conversation about harm, right? And so it's like, well, white children are going to be harmed sitting there listening to these new stories. But I do think, to a certain extent, that the story of the United States and sort of like really understanding it as a settler colony is absolutely something that, we've sort of now begun to really talk about in terms of scholarship, and even like sort of these new kind of historical projects. But it's an important one, especially for those of us who've lived through colonialism, and the US, sort of like has come into our borders as opposed to us going to the US. So I think in some cases, for those communities that have lived under these sort of circumstances, it's sort of like, who do we choose? Who gets to be uncomfortable, and who has sort of the right to be uncomfortable in certain cases? Because a lot of our kids, I would say, have been uncomfortable for a really long time, in the US history classroom. And sort of like, why sort of all this pressure now that maybe we don't want, certain kids to hear about these really difficult stories, right? Or these stories. No, you know what I mean? I was actually just listening before this about a mom who was like, I just don't want my child to even hear about some of these things. And there's a part of me that's like, how will you not? How will they never know, right?
Right,
So,
right. But
it's interesting.
I mean, but I would say the whole language of comfort is part of the problem. I really
Absolutely.
think so,
Absolutely.
right? When that district in Tennessee tried to get rid of mouse, they said, reading mouse is going to make people uncomfortable. And I just felt like, if that doesn't make you uncomfortable, like, you're a sociopath. I mean,
right,
of course,
right.
What could be more uncomfortable than that? Of course, it's going to make you feel uncomfortable, and that's the problem, right? I mean, we can't all be smiley faces. History
Absolutely.
is full of discomforting things,
Absolutely.
but hopefully we can discuss them. I mean, if I were king, and we don't have enough time this evening to enumerate all the reasons that's not going to happen, every high school history teacher would give students the 1619 Project and the state-approved textbook, and would just say, okay, kids, like, let's start with Columbus. What does 1619 say? What does your textbook say? Let's do the American Revolution. What does 1619 Project say? What does your textbook say? And there, by the way, there are teachers who've been doing this, and I think we should know much more about that. I've tried to flag them in my own work. And there's actually a great book by Robbie Cohen and Sonia Moore about Howard Zinn, not about Howard Zinn, that's been done many times, how he's been taught. And they too found incidences of teachers giving students parts of a people's history of the United States and the textbook, and having them compare. And what's great is Zinn's papers are at the Townament Library at NYU, and they got into those papers. Some of the teachers had the kids write to Howard Zinn. And these letters are great. They're a great rejoinder to this, again, fear that somehow the students are going to be corrupted.
They can't handle it, right?
Write to Zinn, and they're like, I think you were off about the Wobblies. And what you wrote about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I didn't think that was right either. I mean, they take issue with them, right? They're not robots, right? They're young citizens. But we disagree about the past in fundamental ways. We're just afraid to let the kids in on that little secret. And that's the heart of the matter, right? How many people really want that exercise I described, the 1619 and the state-approved textbook? I don't know how many, including advocates of the 1619 Project. I don't know how many of them would want that, right? Because they would say, well, gee, what if the kids have a bad teacher and they end up thinking that the real textbook is right instead of my right interpretation, right? People enter these dialogues, unfortunately, because they want their point of view privileged, not because they want this thing called critical thinking. Often when you hear that, that's just a sign that the person thinks that if people really critically think, they'll agree with him or her, right? Which is very cynical, right? My students have learned to call that Zimmerman's fallacy, which is if everybody really thought, right, unencumbered by cant and propaganda, they would agree with me. And that suffuses all these dialogues. I think we're all guilty of different parts of it. We really don't want to allow the kids to make up their own minds. I believe we should, and I haven't made a good enough case about it for it, or people like me, right? Where is the interest group called People for Debating the Other Side in schools, right? Where is that? More nuance, more discussion. Ever heard that in any of these school board meetings? Not enough people want it. People like me call that small d democratic education, but we have failed to make a persuasive enough democratic case for it. I mean, if we had, it would exist.
Couple quick thoughts here. I'm going to pose another question for you. The teach both sides model is really compelling, and I think it can really work for certain ways of teaching history. I know that it's also been part of the debate over the banning of Maus, for example, or the teaching of the Holocaust. And it's come up in contemporary discussions right now in this area about related to anti-Semitism. There's no other side of you can't teach the Holocaust didn't happen as the other side and let students decide. So not everything fits that, but it's an excellent model. But it strikes me that one thing that doesn't fall into that category, I'd love to hear you both talk about, are what we might call more identitarian narratives. Marilisa, you talked about the power to be okay, to be an expert in your own story. And many of the texts that are being banned now are not about reinterpretations of history, which is one crucial aspect, but they're about the presentation of identities that some parents, children, some educators find troubling: trans identity, genderqueer identity. So I wonder, can we bring that back into the conversation? How is that different, or is it amenable to the same kind of teaching in two directions? I'd be curious to hear what you think about that group of books.
I mean, I could give that a start in terms of what I know about children's and young adult literature, right? In terms of I think some of this is also going back to how we philosophize about childhood and childhood innocence, and the policing of sexuality, right? And when is sexuality appropriate, at what age, and a lot of ideas that people have about that, right? And I think also who's given that space, because even with the Holocaust conversation, I saw some of the writing about that, and it was sort of well, children shouldn't know that this happened. It's well, there's children who went to those camps, right? Or there's children that have had all of these things happen to them and have it happen to them all the time. So this idea that it shouldn't happen to a child, or it shouldn't be part of your experience as a child, is really also slippery. And in terms of who gets to have that kind of a childhood. But I think in particular with the sexuality piece, I've certainly heard, for example, that some of Out of Darkness, which is a book that was banned quite a bit. I think it's on the PEN list. It's by Ashley Hope Perez. The ways that book has also helped certain young people kind of know that they were in an abusive situation, and it's sort of the ways that some of these books are also about, teaching about sexuality or healthy sexuality and boundaries and sort of different things that I think a lot of parents don't take into account. And they're just thinking, well, they're just going to go crazy with this sexuality, right? There's always the extreme. But I also feel I think we're always going to have this policing of sexuality and what it should look like in that space and in that age. And I just, maybe this does also go back to the religious aspect of maybe people aren't necessarily going and saying that they're for a certain kind of religion. But for example, I was teaching a class the other day about Muslim American narratives. And one of the recommendations for an authentic Muslim American narrative was a website where there's a lot of sort of, protocol and flags about sexuality because of the religion. So thinking about like being an authentic Muslim American narrative, and then also how it has to engage with the Muslim faith, right? And thinking about ways that that is also talking about sexuality and what it permits and doesn't permit. So it's, you know, I think it's in many ways, even the authenticity piece lends itself to policing, because if we're really going to be thinking about like what it would be like to be in that particular faith or have that particular representation, then would that be someone who is, you know, sort of embraced for being queer, for example, right? So I just think it's multi-layered, and I think that sexuality is always going to be a contentious thing for young people because of ideas about innocence and adolescence and that sort of thing.
Yes, well, you know, I to Marilisa's point about the fantasy of childhood innocence, I wrote a book once about the history of sex ed, and one of the things I discovered is there are jokes about sex ed in every country, and the joke is the same. I'll just tell you the Mexican one: two dad and son walking along the street, and dad is kind of hesitating and stuttering, and he says, "You know, son, I think it's time to talk about that thing that we never really talk about. You know, that sex thing." And he's stuttering, and you know, the kid finally just sighs and says, "Okay, Dad, what do you want to know?" And what was amazing is the same joke appeared, or versions of it, in every country I looked at. And the joke is the same, right? The joke is on the adult who's imagining the kid as a sexual innocent, right? But here's the thing. On the identity side, often we're talking about clashing identities. Especially on matters of sexuality, because sex is so tightly bound, not just to faith, as Marilisa was saying, but just to our fundamental ideas of ourselves as human beings. So, you know, one of the most censored books is this book called Genderqueer. And, you know, it's an autobiographical study of somebody, you know, dealing with their, you know, with their sexuality and coming out and all that. Genderqueer includes a graphic depiction of oral sex. It does. So if you're all about valuing identity and diversity, what do you say to, say, a newcomer from, I don't know, a Hindu or a Muslim country that doesn't want their kid exposed to that? Like, that's an identity too, right? And I find my students, you know, often they want to like value diversity in the rainbow, but want everyone to have comprehensive sexual education. And I'm often like, I think you're gonna have to pick and choose here. Right? If you want to say to the newcomer from Morocco or Pakistan, hey, there's a new sheriff in town, like time for the condom on the banana exercise, you can do that, right? But that's going to pose a certain sort of imposition that a lot of liberals who claim to be pro-immigrant and pro-diversity are loath to do in other realms. So it's really complicated. It is about identity, but there are multiple ones at work, and sometimes they're clashing.
Yeah, I would also just add, just to like say something too that's super obvious with some of the conversation about identity and identity politics, is like whiteness as an identity, right? Like, because often what gets flagged is sort of like the difference beyond whiteness. And I also find like in some of my classes that students say things like, well, I don't have a racial identity, so I can't really speak to whatever. And it's like, well, you're white. So, I mean, you know, the way that there's like a neutrality and an invisibility in terms of whiteness, and sort of like what's normative, right? So that's not an identity, but everything else is. And I think that's also something that I am always careful to make sure we see, you know, sort of like what gets seen as othered in some way, and why is it always like invisible in these other realms where it's mostly the whiteness and the normative sexuality.
Really, really helpful. Jonathan, you're bringing up the sex ed history, and those examples calls to mind a piece you published in the Chicago Tribune just this past September, where you offered the way public schools deal with sex ed as a possibility for the way that they could deal with books that parents or other groups might find objectionable. And to give the example, as you point out, in sex ed, parents have the option to opt their kids out of that curriculum, rather than to stop that curriculum from proceeding for anyone. And at the moment, the book bans and the gag orders we're looking at are taking the second tack. They're stopping it for everyone, right, or preventing teachers from talking about it to anyone, because of an objection on particular grounds. So your proposal is that we should encourage the possibility for parents to opt children out of reading particular books individually, the way we do with sex ed. Is that going to be a feasible way to address this?
I'm not really sure. And just to be clear, I mean, I know that this proposal would impose all kinds of new burdens on both librarians and teachers, about which I feel quite ambivalent. But it did come out of my research on sex ed, because I think the opt-out provision in sex ed has worked. And when I say it's worked, I mean it's worked in a democratic sense, right? We are an irreducibly diverse country, right? With thousands of different ethnic and religious and racial identities. And so we need to strike compromises. And I think the opt-out provision in sex ed has worked pretty well, that it's allowed sex ed to continue in places where it probably couldn't have without the opt-out provision. So I started thinking about that with respect to a book like Genderqueer. Look, I don't think you as a parent have a right to prevent anybody's kid from reading Genderqueer. I really do not. And I believe that as deeply as I believe anything. But I think you do have the power to prevent your own kid from reading it, and I think you probably should, so it would seem to be quite legitimate for a library to say, look, if a parent doesn't want Genderqueer taken out by their kid, we'll just put their name on a list and we'll program the computer so that kid can't take out Genderqueer, but everybody else can. Because just because you don't like it, all right, your complaint is not going to be determinative for everybody else. Because that's been the pattern in so many school boards. A couple very loud people raise their voices and then the book is gone. Or it's put in some hard to reach place. No, everyone should have access to that book. Except, I would argue, the handful of parents and kids that really don't want it. And that seems to me to be at least a possible compromise that would allow, let's be clear, the majority of parents who do want their kids to have access to this book to continue to have access to it, right? But allow the parents who often, again, for very deep religious or kind of ethnic cultural reasons, don't think it's appropriate for their 13 or 14-year-old daughter or son to see that. It would allow them to have a say, but not for the rest of us, for their kids.
And that would honor your interest, for example, in having parents be involved, be more involved. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when I was a high school and a middle school teacher, I was always amused because one of the complaints on the part of teachers was always that the parents weren't involved and they don't care. But then a parent would show up and start complaining, and the teacher would be like, I can't get Mrs. Smith off my ass. It's like, make up our mind here, right? You can't in the one breath complain that they're not involved and then complain when they are.
Marilisa, what kinds of responses to the surge in bans and gag orders do you think might be feasible?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because I think we're really in a moment where it's legislation, right? Like, so it's not just sort of, this, I think the precedents that it could set for, other states or other districts. And I think that's what concerns me. I think it also has, I'm also thinking about like repercussions beyond just, if it's student activism, what kinds of students and how are they more vulnerable perhaps in certain spaces where over policing of schools and communities of color. And there's other ways that this could also easily, escalate into other issues, school to prison pipeline I'm thinking about as well. And I think, for me, I'm also, how can we also think about ways that we could have more programs like what they did in New York City with the Black Studies, in the elementary school, and so that we're still thinking about ways to have curriculum that is representative of this community, and of the United States as it is, and as the school districts as they are. But I do think that, this idea of opting out, I'm wondering if it works in the same way, if it's, not necessarily perhaps about sexual content, but what about racial content, because it sort of also reminds me of, similar to something that you were also saying, Jonathan, with, the history of like Christian schools and, ways that it sort of it's, well, we'll just take this somewhere else. We'll just have these other ways that we can kind of de facto segregation, right? Like, so those are the things that sort of concern me about those kinds of policies, because I wonder also who has the freedom to do that, who has the time to do that, all those different things, and different students and families that may not feel empowered to, you know, speak up in the same ways.
Mhm.
And that's what concerns me.
But, since you mentioned segregation and taking things elsewhere, I'd like to raise some questions about ethnic studies, which I have in my own work. I'm a fan of ethnic studies. I've taught ethnic studies courses, but over the long span, I've argued in my work that ethnic studies courses have often had a quite conservative consequence, and here's how. They
Mhm.
let the regular curriculum off the hook.
Hmm.
Hey, the US history teacher doesn't have to teach about African American history. Why? Because look, there's a Black Studies course. Now, James
Hmm.
Baldwin said that African Americans are the most American people of all. They've been here the longest and they paid the highest price. And I believe that. And I believe if you don't know Black history, you don't know American history, period. So I'm all for having a Black Studies elective, but I don't think that elective should substitute for, we should pretend that it should substitute for what's in the regular curriculum. I think it should be an addendum.
Hmm.
Because I think if you don't understand the Black experience, you don't understand America, period.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I hear you. I just think that that also sounds sort of like, well, we're just going to build it into the curriculum, you know,
we
which could, I
should.
think, could easily, but I think that could easily lead to like sort of colorblind racism and ways that it's just like, well, this is just a personal preference, or it's already built in. And
No,
I
it's
think
not
there's
a
a
personal
difference,
preference.
right?
It's
But
a
I think it's also a
historical
difference
reality.
between, there's a difference between content and also framework, right? So I'm thinking also of like, how can we, because I think with the ethnic studies, and I don't think it's a perfect framework in any ways, and it also leads to ethno-nationalism, you know, if we're not careful, and sort of problematic ways that, you know, it's exclusive and we need to be critical and nuanced about it. But I think that, you know, something I think that I really would like to argue for is the framework, not just the content. So you could easily have someone teaching about at whatever, you know, Latinos, you know, black, you know, black people here, and sort of these like different contents. But the framework, I think, is really what the ethnic studies methodology is trying to bring, and really understanding that in terms of like the epistemologies that we bring in, and so I think the way that someone who's a Black Studies major would teach about African American history might be very different from someone who doesn't have that training, who's teaching the same kind of content, in terms of the ways that they would frame. And, you know, and I think that also comes back to trusting teachers, right? But very few people have that training. And I think some of the things that I'm talking about are not just content, but also training and pedagogy.
Mhm.
I've been watching our time and I see we have rolled just past 8:21, and here's Nora. Nora, we'd like to open things up for Q&A from our audience. Would you mind selecting some questions from the Q&A list?
Yeah, we do have a few here that we have time to get to a few of them. I have two here that are sort of connected on that topic of opting out, those options. So two-part, I'll combine these. Where does opt-out leave children whose parents are at odds with what the children wishes to read? Thinking about LGBTQ students, for example. And then on the other side of that, how do you prevent kids from borrowing their friends' books, especially when you've slapped the forbidden label on it? Can you address those two ideas?
Yeah, I'd like to. I mean, just because this came up in one of my classes a few weeks ago, because we discussed the same subject. And a student who identifies as gay, and who I've taught for a long time, he laughed when somebody said, "Oh, the poor gay kid needs this book, or they won't, be able to find out about this subject." He's like, I found out all about, this subject from this thing called the internet, and he just wasn't buying it for whatever reason. He just said, look, he doesn't want to ban genderqueer, obviously, but he said he finds it tendentious to imagine that there would be an adolescent who, if not for getting genderqueer, won't have any resource or any information about this subject. I think this comes back to like what Marilisa was talking about, this image of childhood innocence, right, that runs through all of this, right? I suppose we could imagine circumstances where a person's media environment was so controlled that, if not for getting genderqueer, they can't find out about this subject. But in this digital age, that seems pretty unlikely to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the access issue is interesting, and I think young people could find these narratives in any number of ways, and in many ways write a bunch of stories. And if you look at the internet, they're writing fan fiction, they're writing so many things right on their own. Do they even really need us? In many ways, might be another question. But I think there's still a desire for people to have access in the schools, right? And specifically in terms of where their children are being, taught and prioritized, is also for college preparation and the way that these kinds of ideas are valued as preparing people to be leaders and further for, sort of potentially even on a PhD exam, and all these different ways that certain stories and literatures are valued and seen and esteemed as scholarly and rigorous, and all these different things that we talk about in the academy. So I do think that's one of the things that people are looking for in being centered in the curriculum, as well as being, centered as knowledge. And I think that's the perspective perhaps that these young people are also looking for.
Thank you. We have another question with the idea of how a few loud, motivated parents perhaps are imposing bans, or maybe not always parents, in various populations. And then the idea of promoting more nuance and discussion around these topics. What do you propose actively for talking with adamant parents who insist on bans in schools or public libraries? And when does one realize that, or what does one do when one realizes if the person that you're engaged with is utterly resistant to good faith discussion or compromise?
Marilisa, would you like to take that one on?
I'll try. I mean, I think a lot of, I know, for example, in some of the trainings and conversations that I've had are like, the emotional labor, right? And sort of the ways that I wonder who is doing the explaining and the constant explaining, right? Like, so who is it on to constantly sort of rehash and show the legitimacy of a perspective. So that's, if we're wanting to have a true conversation, I'm hoping that it's not just people kind of, listening or just talking at each other. So, I'm wondering what kind of organizing is happening around that. I don't know if it's a general conversation about that, but there certainly are organizations. For example, Teaching for Change is one that I've worked with, where they do have webinars and trainings and conversations around this very thing, and how to get teachers and parents and students together to talk about that. So I think that there are a lot of also around in different cities. In New York, there's NICOR. Obviously, it's a very radical organization, but there's sort of like different ways that people can get tapped into like-mindedness. Not to say that we all have to agree, but at least people who are interested in having a conversation. But I do think that I worry about people getting into conversations that aren't going to go anywhere and that are just a waste of your emotional labor. And I think that's just not productive, right? So like, what's the goal? What's the outcome? And that's what I would ask.
And those are really good questions. And obviously the answers are going to vary depending on temperament, identity, circumstance, history, all that stuff. I guess, I mean, since I'm sure we have other librarians on the call, I just want to say that they're on the front lines of this, right? I think they've been put in an extremely precarious place. I think that the best ones, first of all, they thank people for their participation and for their input and for exercising their voice and their rights. And then they also try to explain the procedures that are involved in these decisions. Because all democracies, if they're real democracies, both allow people to speak, but also have procedures for adjudicating different kinds of speech and different kinds of disagreement. And I think underscoring both of those is the key. You have the right to say and think whatever you want about genderqueer, right? And you can scream it to the hills and to me. But whether genderqueer remains in our library or our school is a different question. And it doesn't rely just on you or on me, or on the volume or the lung capacity of whomever is talking, right? There's a procedure that's in place, and for democracies to work, you kind of need those things, right? You can't ad hoc this stuff. And, you know, librarians have spent their careers training and thinking about which books are age appropriate and which books are most useful for different citizens. And they've also developed procedures to adjudicate complaints. And I think it's fair in the same breath to thank and even celebrate somebody for exercising their voice, and also making it clear that we always don't get what we want, that that's part of the story as well.
Thank you. We have a question we talked a lot about sort of younger children. We had someone who asked, you talk about book banning is promoted under the guise of protecting children, but what about college students who want to be protected themselves and avoid controversial topics? Can you speak to that at all?
Yes, well, this is something I've also written about. And I think that, you know, there are many problems with college professors, but one of them is they imagine these people come to us as like tabula rasas, you know, like as these sort of blank slates. But of course they don't. That's one of the reasons we're having this discussion, right? They've had 18 years of schooling or of different kinds of socialization. And, you know, I think that they too have integrated a lot of this psychological language, you know, about triggering, about microaggressions, about safety. And I want to be clear, I don't object to this psychological language for psychology. I just don't think psychology and politics or psychology and education play particularly well. So if you were to say that you were triggered by something I said in this webinar, I would have pretty much one thing to say to you, which is, I'm sorry. And I would be. I don't want to harm people. But that's the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is there's nothing more to say. It's a cul-de-sac, right? You harmed or injured me in some way, end of story. Maybe I could ask you why you were harmed or injured, but I certainly wouldn't deny that you were. I can't look into your soul, right? So I think the problem is our students have been socialized to think in these psychological ways and to imagine these issues as psychological ones. Look, I'm not against psychology. My family and I have been great beneficiaries of psychology. I just don't think psychology is the right frame for thinking about these issues, but I think we've taught our students to do so.
I mean, I think it's interesting also to think about this in different states. For example, I know some colleagues who teach in Florida, and they are specifically sort of like being told you can't, you can't sort of say certain things, right? You can't teach, and you're not allowed to do certain things. And even at the college level, where they really feel like they're being, they're not teaching the courses in the same way that they would have been teaching if they hadn't been told certain things. And even recently with DeSantis and just all the different things that have been going on. But I think it's also that the kinds of classes that I teach, I'm always very sort of upfront about, on my syllabi, it's like, we're going to talk about, sort of like, we're going to talk about these things. And this is the kind of class where this is an important topic. We're going to talk about race, sexuality. We're going to talk about, if this is not for you, then maybe this is not the best class for you, and I'm sort of very upfront about that. And it may not be the best class for them. But I also tell students, I try to sort of cultivate the space. And I think that this is an important thing also. And it's not just the content, it's also the teaching. And it's the way that we, cultivate a space where people feel that they can have these kind of conversations, right? And that we're willing to listen. But I've certainly also, told students, for example, who feel like, I just don't feel comfortable. I don't know if I can say anything. I feel like I'm being, if I'm afraid to make a mistake, I'm afraid to sound racist even. What I've always said, is sort of like, you have to engage. You at least have to engage. Don't say it's too hard. I'm just not going to talk about it. We're just, we're not going to have a conversation at all. Just at least engage. And I think there are ways also in our like current Moodle world or like online school world where we can have like a forum where you can have a discussion forum. If no one wants to say it out loud, you can at least post it online. I'll be able to see it, or have a journal that I can at least see that you've engaged in this conversation, right? In different ways that we can sort of give students to express their ideas, whatever they are. And I think those are ways that I've, kind of maneuvered it, because I can understand it's hard to talk about certain things, obviously. But how can we at least engage in the conversation? And how can I, as an instructor, help people with that and model that as well?
I just add two things to those excellent comments. First of all, I think it's really important to underscore that some of the measures that Bill Gleason mentioned from the PEN America report at the beginning, some of them apply to higher ed. Like, there are professors at Oklahoma who have changed their curriculum.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is appalling. And it just runs directly counter to 100 years of tradition and academic freedom. But I think those of us who are concerned about this should also acknowledge some of the things that Marilisa was describing, which is that there are informal kinds of censorship that go on our campuses as well, right? The big problem where I teach is not like bat-wielding bad guys with sunglasses walking around, censoring people. That's not it at all. It's the fact that we've created environments where people are afraid to offend, right? And afraid to speak their mind. This isn't an opinion, this is a fact. And there's lots of data about it that's been collected for the past couple of years. So let's take one contemporary example. Affirmative action is back on the docket, right? There were just a Supreme Court case in which there were kind of two constitutional challenges to it. I should just say, just for full disclosure, that I'm a supporter of affirmative action. But in the United States, I'm in the minority. So the Pew Research Fund just put out a big report about this in the spring, where they found out if you ask Americans, do you believe race and ethnicity should be used as a factor in college admissions? The majority of Americans say no, and that includes the majority of Black and Brown Americans. Okay, so those are the facts, all right? But you know what? You wouldn't know that on my campus, right? And you wouldn't know that because, we have erected informal, I think, prohibitions and barriers on a real discussion of this matter. Incidentally, the surveys on students show they're also split down the middle on these questions, and it doesn't follow racial lines at all. So we're not really talking about it. And that's not because of a law, and it's not because of some bad Republican in Oklahoma, right? It's because of the cultures that we've created on our campuses, which are often inimical to real discussion of the issues that divide us.
Bill, anything you want to add to this? I know you're moderating, but since in the college theme, anything to add on this point?
I'll just say briefly, I've seen both of what Marilisa and Jonathan describe on my own campus. Students who are concerned about what they're reading, some students who may be fearful of expressing opinions that could be perceived as controversial, and also not here, but Jonathan's example of Oklahoma, these laws, the bans do rise up above public school education. So they are dealing with adults when you're talking about college curriculum. So these questions aren't limited to just to public libraries and to public schools. I think that's the importance of that question. So thank you, whoever asked that.
Thank you all. I'm going to ask one last question. We're just about at the end of our time, but I want to thank everybody so far who's submitted questions. This is maybe a distillation of some of the things you've talked about already, but we had somebody who asked, if a group comes to my local school board arguing for book banning, how should I argue against it? What might be some talking points if I only have 3 minutes to make my argument at a school board meeting?
I think I would start by making a paean to democracy and to America. I would start by saying, look, the great thing about this country is that we get to disagree. I understand your position, I understand your objections, but we live in a democracy, and what that means is everybody gets a say. And I feel fortunate to do that, and to live in a place where what I think or what you think doesn't necessarily hold sway, because in a democracy, these decisions are collective. And long live America.
Yeah, I'm sort of having my old journalism professor come back in my head, you know, sort of like I'm thinking also of like Milton's Areopagitica. That is not a 3-minute, you know, talking speech. But I was gonna say I think free marketplace of ideas is always something that people can embrace also in terms of like the ideals of the democracy. I think also listen to some of these school boards, and this is not a talking point, but listen to some of these meetings and listen to the ways that young people are talking, you know, and it's just amazing to even hear. So like to just hear some of the ways that people are engaging in these conversations, it's an opportunity for all of us to also see how much they've learned and how much they have to say. And I think that this is an increasing, you know, it's increasing knowledge, it's increasing critical thinking. You know, we were talking about that sort of earlier, and the importance of being able to know what you stand for and what you're willing to also stand up for, right? And I think we've seen those lessons in the book bans, regardless of whether or not someone's horrified by a text. We see the ways that especially our young people and our teachers are organizing and writing. I mean, some of them have written about these, you know, moments and also taken to creating their own literature about it. So the way that it's increasing, you know, learning, which is ultimately what we want to see happen, but also with the democracy argument that if we really believe in that, then we're going to have to put that front and center, and that should include at all levels of education.
And I'd offer two things. I would say bans breed bans. A culture that accepts banning as a way of dealing with controversial material will be willing to accept the next ban and the next ban and the next ban. And I would say, if you push this ban through, are you willing for the next ban to ban the things that you want your children to read? And if so, then let's just then go ahead. But if not, if that would make you concerned, then maybe this ban isn't a good idea. And the other thing I would say is, can you imagine anyone who might benefit from reading this book? Anyone. And if the answer is yes, if there's one person you can imagine who would benefit from reading this book, then why would we ban it? We might want to invite some people to opt out, but the all or nothing approach doesn't really serve anyone. I think that's what both of those suggestions might have in common.
Thank you all so much for this and for this discussion. Obviously, this is a topic that hits a lot of people in very emotional places and in very real places, whether, you know, they support certain actions or not. So we're so glad to have had this discussion with you. I know all three of you continue to engage in this discussion online in various publications. And as ever, we would encourage anyone who is attending this to continue to read and find, you know, more information on these topics, to continue to stay informed, again, so that you can, again, know what you believe and be able to discuss that further. So thank you all again so much for being here tonight. We hope you've enjoyed your time. And again, to our speakers, to Bill, to Marilisa, to Jonathan, thank you so much for your spending the evening with us.
Thank you. It was fun. And thanks to our librarians, most of all. Yeah.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.